Hi, this is Jesse Morrison, and I'm here for my final call to action speech. And this is my audience who is going to be asking questions here at the moment. And uh, okay, so what I'm actually here to talk to you about is actually the benefits of stress in life. And the actual idea of doing this as my final exam has been a little bit stressful as it is for any student out there. And I myself was a little bit stressed in getting into this idea, doing this and talking to you about these things. So, in response to that, I actually then benefited by just telling myself I'm just going to wear all white, oddly enough, because going back to another factor of just saying like I'm going to dress in a different way or any little things, is we remotely go over a lot of stress in life. It happens to every single one of us for all different various reasons. And I just decided that by doing this, it gives me my choice in getting away from stress. And the problem that all of us face in this life is that they, for Americans, there's actually about an 80% rating shown that those Americans default to physical aspects of stress. And then right next to that is actually a 75% that goes through a psychological problem with their stress. So those numbers just by themselves are phenomenally high. And it's incredible that we all have to kind of go through that and see those things. Um, Professor Karen Glantz actually is a part of my research. She showed that within her research that the immune system is directly affected by all of our stresses that we go through. That the fight and flight is actually the initial part of it, obviously, that is instigated by the amygdala and all the other problems with it. But it gets the heart rate moving fast, and everything starts moving immediately for the fight or flight idea. But then immediately after that, it goes into the rest and digest phase, which is the chance for it to finally actually relax and come back to yourself and then get back into your normal way of life. But at that point, you've exhausted a lot of things that you truly need in this life. So it's something that is disastrous for our physical and mental health. And we live in a culture right now that stress is kind of considered like a constant factor. It's like an insect, though, and that every successful person can actually just handle it and deal with it, move on with their life. So the idea of stress in itself is a problem because we fail to see that it's even there. We just sort of acknowledge it as an existence, but we don't really confront it. We don't actually face it front hand. So that is our biggest problem. I myself have actually gone through chaotic, endless stress with cancer. So that's my own personal, instigation into stress. So I've gone through several brain surgeries, a lot of physical surgeries, a lot of radiation, things like that, a lot of news and things I've had to look into myself. I've just had to find my own personal ways of actually handling that. It's just an endless level of stress. So I guess it's been a wild life for me because I've had no choice. You have to basically face the stressor itself and come to grips with it, find its solution. So that's what I'm hoping I can get you guys to kind of understand and perhaps then pursue is that stress should not be avoided in this life. You actually have to kind of look at it like any other problem. You have to understand what's going on and find out where your actual problem is and then face it rather than run away from it. It doesn't actually bring too much glory for the person to just run away from all the problems. So it's something I'd like to continue to talk about. Um, the problem with ignoring the stress mainly is that biologically and psychologically it's happening to most people. It's a problem that everybody has to eventually face. Professor Karen Glantz actually explains a little further into the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. And the fight or flight that I was explaining before is the thing that comes around and it exemplifies the neurons, the noradrenalines, and the adrenalines of our body. And those are the exact items that will push your immune system to incredible lengths. And it is a great thing to invoke that fight or flight. It's just an immediate, like, for survival idea. It's an amazing system to go through, but it is an incredibly short-lived thing to have to go through. And it's just good though. But then the parasympathetic side of the nervous system comes in, and that's where you have to actually, it's the rest and digest. You have to go through it, and that's the point where it's no longer about like the immediate survival. This is a like rest and relax. You have to allow your body to recover from this phenomenal thing you just went through. And the problem with the culture that we've gone through, though, is that we have the stimulants to kind of deter from that. And the problem is that, the rest and digest, we have uh, exhaustion and you have hunger. Those are the things we do. But we always defer from being exhausted. So you drink lots of coffee. You have to drink lots of coffee to stay on your edge. And the exhaustion side is that, you can't do that. It's just this sort of looked as a weakness. And the hunger side of it is by ignoring your stress, you actually defer more towards I'm just going to focus on different things, and you actually kind of defer away from being hungry, oddly enough, as it were. And we starve ourselves. We eat all the wrong things. It's a problem. It's a true problem. And uh, Bruce Rubin is actually an author that I looked into, and he described it in an interesting way with the cells of the immune system, that it actually checks that these cells are provided by the thymus and another organ I do not quite remember. I apologize. But regardless, they have either memory or they're naive cells. And it's interesting because it shows exactly that they're incredibly influenced by stress in the system. Like those ideas, if it's a memory cell or if it's naive, it means that you can actually kind of put a lot of stress on there, but that biologically shows that is psychologically, as much as you want to deny stress and ignore it, there is absolutely no way that that's going to be like inadequate to your biological system. It's a phenomenal process. So it's just something that we really should be looking at and analyzing the stress that you go through. Um, Mary Alvord actually is another author that I found that she described the rest and digest in just the same track as Bruce Rubin did, but she talked about the incredible need of the rest and digest side of things, and she mentioned more so that like the exhaustion that we go through and everything, it happens obviously like we just talked about, but the problems with getting away from it by drinking a ton of coffee or ignoring it, all the problem stuff like Bruce Robin talked about, is that the biological problems or the physiological problems is that it is actually incredibly susceptible to illness, because if you don't allow your immune system or anything else to heal through that rest and digest system, then you can actually go through a tremendous risk for heart disease, depression, and obesity, which is actually, those are high products within American culture. We see that all the damn time. So it's just something that we should always be kind of constantly thinking about. Um, these are actually the problems that I've now seen. So I'd actually like to talk a little bit further then about the solutions, about what we can actually be doing for this. Um, Without a proper level of stress in our culture, and even just overall in a general idea of humankind, it just seems like we would just have one person coddling another person. We have to have stress to motivate ourselves. We have to actually have a drive behind everything we do. Like constantly looking at stress is something that you have to just sort of ignore and cater to for things like that, as in a small sense. It just seems like raising children like that, to look at life in that aspect, is providing them with the idea that this world will provide them with all infantile expectancies, that life isn't all that difficult, but life is merciless without that idea to be instilled in the first place. So it should be looked at a little differently. And I think that that stress enables us to see things like that. Terry Cooper actually described that a little further, with personal accomplishments being a great benefit, because self-esteem has been tied directly to problems with psychological issues and mental illness, of course. And so, without actually having that feel of personal accomplishment and conquering obstacles and problems, it actually defers to the side that being raised in that sense, you actually have a very minor and very small self esteem. So, just like ignoring the stress, then by being raised like that, you end up ignoring that as well. And it actually becomes a very deep seated psychological issue. So, it's interesting because that does sort of present the problem that a lot of people have by just ignoring these problems and ignoring the idea that even stress exists. So, um, further on from that one is a prior dominant theory with psychologists in our era, is that it was all a matter of how much stress you're going through, which determined too much stress or too little stress or anything like that. And that was actually recently disposed of, because it actually presents more so radically in the idea that it is the mindset of how you see stress. It's not a matter of how much stress, because each person is very different. If you're to talk to a college student who has just started school, their level of stress is phenomenal to them. Whereas if you talk to a doctorate student at the end of their degree, this is a student that would look at it and say, yes, I got a lot of stress. But then if you look at their workload, it's something that would actually lay to waste worlds as far as what everybody would consider. So it's literally just your mindset of how you see it. Um, it's more about like how you approach the problems and how you then deal with them, thereon. So, uh, Yale students actually, Elia Krum, Peter Silvery, and Sean Anker actually revealed in that same theory that they interviewed 400 people of a company, and very few of them actually had that mindset that stress is a positive thing. However, they're the ones that actually exhibited the better symptoms of a much productive work process within work. They had a much better bill of health, and they also had a lot more personal accomplishment and success. So a lot of the other folks that they would talk to, they're the ones that actually ended up talking a little bit further, is like all the problems that they were dealing with, a lot more excuses, and they just had a lot more exhibited problems. So it truly is more or less about the mindset you have in this idea. So Dr. Shelton actually then goes on to explain that a little further, because the levels within the brain of cortisol actually go along with this as well. And that is a delicate level. If it's too little or too high, it is incredibly damaging. So it is essential that it is actually a decent level within those cortisol levels. And those that actually have that mindset that stress is not a debilitating factor, they actually exhibit very optimal levels of cortisol. So it really is more or less, you have to see it in a better mind frame. You have to understand that stress is existent and how you deal with it in a positive manner. So it is interesting though, stress. It happens. It's a natural factor of life. It's inevitable. You have to be able to confront it. You have to be able to talk about it. You have to acknowledge it. It has to be a part of your life and seen as a motivational force. Uh, Mulred Perez actually, is within his book, describes that a lot of stress actually develops into a coping mechanism with like using depression and other ideas of like psychological problems to deal with stress, and it actually exhibits a little further into sort of personally accepting responsibility of negative actions and taking that as your own personal responsibility and stuff. There's things that like it doesn't really quite make any sense. Like you're taking on the weight of the world when you really don't have to. So it's just it's a problem, but it's actually a better equipped if you approach this in a more positive light in the first place rather than debilitating in the very end. So considering that stress is actually going to happen whether we wanted to or not, um, it's better to know that you actually have the option, and that it is ultimately experienced no matter what. Amanda McMillan actually explained in her book as well that stress is actually considered a negative sense at all times. And that's an interesting concept because the chemical interleukin actually is the thing that helps regulate the immune system. And that's the problem with having that negative side on approaching your stress is that level actually reduces more so when you see it in a negative sense. Whereas actually, if you utilize it as a challenge, uh, it helps with the fight or flight response and helps with the rest and digest response. So it's a intricate concept, but it really does kind of break down into a very basic. Your mindset on this is ultimately what is going to determine how this affects you. So, for that in mind, I'd like to then like talk with you a little further then about like the action of what we can do about this. As far as stress being a constant factor in our lives, it shouldn't be looked at as a negative factor. It should be looked at as a positive. Obviously, phenomenal amounts of stress should just be handled in a much more positive light. It shouldn't be so debilitating. It should be looked at as obviously it's a problem, but it shouldn't be ignored. It should be considered something that is actually very motivating, and it shouldn't like debilitate you to the point where you have to stay home to sort of avoid everything. And it actually should call to action the idea that you can help yourself. You have to find the problem. It's right there. You have to find it. It's causing you the stress. You do need you need a solution to this problem. This is something that I myself have personally gone through again with the cancer. Is that it's just one of those things that it doesn't ever just go away. You have to just face it and understand it. And I've always been amazed by the amount of people that can talk to me about that same thing with cancer, as far as like they hear that it's cancer they have, but they'll still amazed that perhaps in say better shape than they are, or I'm very active, or I'm in school pursuing a medical degree and I still have 4.0. Little things like that. It's like people always see that as like that's amazing that you're not just sort of sitting at home and thinking about all the bad things. And it's inevitable. Bad things happen to every single one of us. So it should actually be something that's a little more inspiring you to do better things with your life, to understand it further and find a solution. I found my own personal solutions, and I think that everyone here actually could do the exact same with all their stresses. So I appreciate you letting me talk to you about all this. Yeah. Thank you for clapping.